This is the mini lecture for social problems, chapters 3 and 4. Again, if you have access to a printer, it's a good idea, if you can, to print out a copy of the outline so that you can follow along with the lecture and maybe make some notes. In chapter 3, it covers racial and ethnic inequality, and there's a lot of definitions, and several of them will be on the quiz. So I'm going to try to go over those thoroughly, and you can take some notes if you wish. The first thing they talk about in the book is what is an ethnic group? And the definition in the book says it's a group that share a common set of cultural characteristics. Now, many of you probably relate to a certain culture. My culture, the one I relate to, is Portuguese. I was raised in a Portuguese family, and there are definitely certain characteristics within the Portuguese culture, the certain foods that they cook and religious traditions and celebrations. So many of you probably have some cultural background that you can connect to. And many people do have cultures that they feel deeply connected to. Well, then they talk about something called ethnocentrism. And they say it's the tendency to view your own culture as absolute and better than others, and to judge all others by those values. And I know a lot of us feel that it's white people that really are the most ethnocentric, that we all think that white people are better than other people, and we judge others by that. But actually, that is not true. Every culture really is ethnocentric to a certain degree. And again, from my own experience, the Portuguese culture, they are very ethnocentric. For example, they believe that no one is cleaner than they are, and no one works harder than they do. And so, do they judge other people by that? Yes. If a Portuguese person goes into someone's house and they don't feel or if it's messy at all, they always have comments to their friends or family about how they are not very clean. And in Portuguese culture, work is everything. And so if someone leaves work early, they're looked down on. Oh, that person left at 4 o'clock. I stayed till 7 o'clock. And so every culture really deep down believes that their culture is the best, and they tend to judge other cultures by their own values. And again, that's called ethnocentrism. Well, what is the definition of an ethnic minority? And it says a group that suffers prejudice and discrimination at the hands of a larger group. Now, it's important to understand there is a difference between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a thought, it's an attitude, whereas discrimination is an act, an actual action taken against someone or a group. So even though we use them in the same context and we talk a lot about prejudice and discrimination, again, prejudice is the attitude, discrimination is an action. While many of us are guilty of using what we call ethnic stereotypes, and those are attitudes in which people portray all members of a certain ethnic group as having the same set of usually negative characteristics. Again, for example, all blondes are dumb. That's just one thing that I think a lot of people have heard. So it's giving a certain group a set of negative characteristics, and not looking at them as individuals, but looking at them as a group and stereotyping each one as being the same. And usually, again, it's in a negative sense. Well, race. And they say that race is a group of people thought to have a common set of physical characteristics and ancestry. And if you look at most cultures, many, not all, but many cultures have certain physical characteristics, the color of their skin, certain facial features. And so it's people that have a common set of those. And they are considered to be of the same race. And usually, again, they have the same ancestry background. They're from the same area in the world. And then what is racism? Racism is a belief in the superiority of one racial group over another. And that does lead to prejudice and or discrimination. And again, remember that prejudice is the attitude, discrimination is the action. And we know, especially after seeing what's happened this summer, the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter, we know that in many, many ways in our country and in many countries, racism is still very prevalent, very common. It's a big problem. And again, it's because a lot of us do feel that our culture, our race is the best. And we tend to judge others and by that and feel we're better than other people. And from that, again, racism develops. Well, what really is at the bottom of racism? And it's the concept of domination. And that is a social system in which one ethnic group holds power and uses it to keep other groups in a subordinate or lower position. And so much of racism and discrimination is about domination. It's about not only one group feeling they're better than another group, but it's dominating and having power over everybody else. So domination is really at the bottom of racism, wanting to dominate and have power over other people. Being in control. Well, what are some of the things that have happened from racism? And that is segregation, and that is the separation of two or more racial or ethnic groups. So in other words, to keep them separate. So I think most of us have heard the term segregation. And in the South, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when they started the civil rights movement, maybe some of you have seen in some of the documentaries or some of the film clips, even this summer, that have been on television or on social media, that Black people in particular in the South were separated, segregated from white people. They had a separate entrance into restaurants. They had different water fountains. I was raised in the South, and I went there in 1959. So I was there in the beginning of the civil rights movement, and there were restaurants in the town that I lived in that segregated the blacks from the whites. And there were separate drinking fountains. There were separate entrances into restaurants. And in some restaurants, the Black people are not even allowed to eat. They were allowed to work there, but not allowed to eat there. So those kind of attitudes are called segregation, keeping certain groups separate from each other. But then there's another term that they call integration, and that is a social system in which a person's ethnic background isn't important. And people from different ethnic backgrounds live in the same neighborhood and use the same social, economic, and political relationships. So when a community or a group is integrated, the differences in their culture or their race are not as important, and everyone can use the same institutions, the same schools. The classrooms are diverse. There's all kinds of different cultures in every classroom, and people aren't segregated. People are allowed to use restaurants and schools and all the other social institutions equally. And so that is called integration. Well, then there was something called pluralism, and that really came out of a movement, again in the South, that happened started with a movement by the Alabama governor years ago in the 60s, and his name was George Wallace. And when the Civil Rights Amendment, the Voting Rights Amendment, was signed into law, he began to realize that a lot of Black people were going to be voting a lot more. And he wanted to get their vote, but he also wanted to keep the white vote. And in order to get reelected, which he wanted to do, he felt like he needed to appeal to both groups. So before that, before the Civil Rights Act and was amended with the Voting Rights Act, mostly in a lot of places, white people were the only ones or the majority that voted. They made it very difficult for people of color to vote. They had to be able to write, they had to be able to read a certain level, and they knew that many people of color weren't educated. So it was a very easy way to keep them from voting. And that's why 50, 60 years ago, especially in the South, most of the political positions were held by white people. So when the Voting Rights Act was passed, George Wallace got scared that maybe he wouldn't get reelected. So he started talking about something they called pluralism, and his term for it was separate but equal. So what the definition of pluralism is, that it would be a social system in which there are distinct and separate ethnic groups that do maintain equal social, economic, and political relationships. Well, what that means and what George Wallace told people when he was campaigning was that um, he would he would not force the schools to be integrated. He would not force a lot of integration, but he would make sure that black people got just as good as schools and opportunities as white people. So he told people that he would keep the groups separate, but that both would have equal access to opportunities. Well, we know that wasn't going to happen, but that's what he told people in order to try to get both groups to vote for him. And that was called, again, separate but equal, but the term they use for that today is pluralism. But I don't think pluralism really fulfills the goals that it says it does. Uh, because I think when you keep people separate, you cannot have equal access to all opportunities. But the other definition is assimilation, and that is a process by which a person takes on a new culture. And for some groups, that's easier than others. When you see a great deal of immigration today, you've got people that live in countries that are war torn, that are full of poverty, that they actually are being killed by their own governments. And so a lot of those people are trying to flee their country and come to a country where they feel safer and have more opportunities. And so you see more and more people um, coming into new countries and trying to assimilate, which means learn to fit in to the new way of life. And it is difficult and more difficult for some groups than others. When you have groups of people whose values match those of the country they are going into, it's easier for them. But when you have people who go to a new country and their religion or their cultural beliefs are really different than the new country, then you may see more difficulty. But the more a group of people assimilate into the culture, obviously the easier it's going to be for them. Well, there's two ways that they do talk about assimilation. How do we go to a new country or a new area and try to fit in? And they say that there's two approaches. One of them is called the melting pot, and that's the belief that different ethnic groups should learn from each other and they should actually merge to create a new culture. In other words, everybody that comes to America should now consider themselves Americans. So Americans would be the new culture. So you have people from Israel, people from Mexico, people from Europe, people from Afghanistan. You have people from all over the world that come, India, that come to America. But it's to say that they all learn from each other and kind of merge together, the melting pot. And they come up with a brand new culture, which would be essentially American. But the other idea is called salad bowl. The belief that a society should encourage its ethnic groups to maintain their own distinctive cultural characteristics. So it means that if you go into a new country, maybe you can learn some of the new ways, but you hang on to the old ways. Well, again, there's advantages and disadvantages of this. I think I do think it's nice to hang on to some of your ancestry, some of the cultural traditions from your background. I know as a Portuguese background, we still cook linguiça and Portuguese food. We still do some of the Portuguese celebrations here at the Portuguese Hall on Main Street. But we also, there's a lot of Portuguese families here from the Azore Islands, some from the mainland, Portugal, but a lot from the Azores. And most of those people do try to learn English. They try to learn the new language. So the more you do that, the easier you can fit in. But on the other hand, should we just give up all of our cultural and all of our traditions? And so how do you blend that together? How do you make the melting pot and the salad bowl come together? And it isn't easy. I don't know if you need to do either one in an extreme way. I don't know if you should just melt together and forget all of your background and all of your traditions from your culture. But if you don't assimilate to a certain degree, there will be a great deal of difficulty, and you are much more likely to get discriminated against if you don't try to fit into the new culture. Well, one of the kind of interesting ideas is called contrast conceptions. And what that is, it's when two ethnic groups start to form very strong negative stereotypes against each other. Now, instead of coming together, for example, Asian gangs and Hispanic gangs have had a history of a lot of fighting and turmoil against each other. And to me, it would seem to make more sense for them to come together and try to fight the prejudice and discrimination that they both experience. But what tends to happen when you're in an ethnic group that has suffered prejudice and discrimination is you get very frustrated and you get very, very angry. So is it possible, or how far is it going to get you to be angry and to fight against the dominant culture? Well, it's difficult, and you're probably going to get beaten down even more. So because they can't take that frustration out on the dominant group, they tend to take it out on each other, which is really unfortunate, because they could probably do all of themselves a lot better if they would join together. But again, because it's so hard to fight the dominant group, they tend to take their frustrations out on each other. So that is called contrast conceptions. Now, obviously, what happens from discrimination, there's so many examples of the damage that it does. When we just talk about, again, the Black Lives Matter, the police brutality, do police tend to racially profile certain groups of people? Well, absolutely they do, and that's been documented for many, many decades. But how do you fight against that? So we know that there have been many horrible social problems that have come of racism and discrimination. So many groups have been deprived of opportunities and are treated horribly. So one of the outcomes of racism and prejudice and discrimination is poverty. And it says poverty is related by race by putting people in certain groups, preventing them from certain opportunities in which they can succeed. And so frequently you've got a pattern that a lot of racial groups in our country and in other countries are kept out of certain opportunities, educational opportunities, and so it's like it tends to be a perpetual cycle that if you can't get the education and if you can't get a good job, then you stay in poverty, and then your children, you can't help your children to get an education. And if you don't get an education in this country, it's pretty difficult to do well. Some people can do it if they work hard enough and they have a good personality and they don't give up, but it's hard. And yet, if you grow up in poverty, it is very difficult for your family to help you get that education. And in fact, that tends to be one of the very difficult things about, and when they talk about institutional racism, preventing minorities from being part of an institution. One of the most blatant examples of institutional racism is the situation about education in our country. Now, we do know that there is financial aid for certain groups of people that live in poverty, but it's very difficult for people of poverty to get the kind of education that will prepare them to go to an Ivy League school like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford. They can do it, but it's very, very difficult, because frequently if they've lived in an area where there was a lot of poverty, even their elementary schools weren't as good as the children that grew up in a rich area and their schools. And so all the way through their educational process, they didn't get the opportunities and the educational opportunities. And so when it comes to taking the SAT tests or trying to get into one of the top colleges, it's very difficult for them. And it doesn't mean they're not as smart. It just means that they haven't had the education along the way to prepare them to that level. So frequently you see certain racial groups that have a very difficult time getting the type of education that will really get them the high-paying jobs and change their whole economic background. So that is one way that we see institutional racism affects people. And it tends to be, it is very expensive to go to Harvard and Yale and Stanford. And in a way, it's almost may even seem um, intentional that they keep the price very high so that certain people that can't afford it won't be able to go there. And unfortunately, you do see that most of the wealth in this country, as we talked about in the last chapters, it goes to a lot of white families. And so just making education so expensive tends to make it very difficult for people of certain racial groups to get the kind of education to get them out of poverty. So definitely we do see institutional racism is still very prevalent in our country and in other countries also. Um, Although it's against the law to say that you cannot go to a certain school because of you're of a certain color, that is against the law. But to make it difficult financially is one way that they get around that and make it very difficult and keep people out. So institutional racism is kind of insidious. It's there, and sometimes you can't always put your finger on it, but it's there. And then just a couple of facts, which are kind of interesting, and that is that of all of the racial groups, Puerto Ricans are the ones with the highest level of poverty. And we don't see too many Puerto Ricans in our valley, but in New York and Florida, there are large populations, and they do tend to suffer a lot of prejudice and discrimination. So they have a very high level of poverty. And then the religious group that has the lowest income are Presbyterians, which is kind of odd. You wouldn't maybe think that, but maybe it's because so many people are Presbyterian that you'd have a higher level of poor people. But when it comes to institutional racism and keeping people out of opportunities and poverty, one of the groups that really suffers the most in our country are the Black families. And the Black families it says, make 56% less money than white families. And so obviously keeping Black people of color, particularly African Americans, out of colleges and certain opportunities really does make a huge difference in their earning power. And very a good example of discrimination. And one of the other points that is kind of interesting, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute, chapter 4, when you look at women of color actually experience what they call double discrimination, because women of color obviously can suffer discrimination because of their racial background, but also is there gender discrimination also? Yes, there is, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So when you look at women of color, you have to realize they have two mountains to climb. Not that discrimination is easy for anyone. It's horrible. It's horrible. But women of color have two mountains to climb. And so they do say it's almost harder for them because they've got to get over the gender bias, but they also have to get over the racial discrimination. So very, very difficult road for women of color. And that's why many of them tend to live in poverty. Very, very difficult for them to get out of that. So we can see where discrimination on any level is has a very negative outcome for people. And one of the homeworks that I do have for Chapter 3 is to get your reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, to the George Floyd death, to the protests, to what is going on today. And I know some of you have been involved in some of those. And again, it's not to judge whether those are right or wrong, but I do think we are seeing a huge, huge change right now. It's been a long, long time since the civil rights movement started. Many of you remember the woman Rosa Parks, who refused to sit in the back of the bus way back in the 50s. And she started what they call the civil rights movement. And of course, there were a lot of other people that joined that, and Martin Luther King was the leader of that movement in the 50s and 60s until he was murdered. But uh, there was movement, there was change, there was improvement, there were opportunities, there was some change. But unfortunately, discrimination and prejudice still was very real in our country. So today, with what's been happening, and I just think part of it is because of social media. Whenever things are going on today, people go around with their phones and they videotape. And so a lot of the things that have been happening for generations, not just with the police, but in lots of situations where there's been discrimination and prejudice, people got away with it because no one ever saw it. But today, that's not true. Today, with cameras and cameras on our phones, we're seeing a lot of things that have been happening over for generations, but now we're all seeing it for ourselves. So this is going to bring about, I think, a lot more change in this area. I'm so, so glad to see that. It's been coming and it needs to happen. Discrimination and prejudice is probably one of the worst social problems that we have today. How do we combat that on a personal level? I really believe that discrimination is learned. Racial prejudices and discrimination. Racism is taught. And many of you have heard of the Ku Klux Klan. It has come and gone over the years, but it still is active. And there are even mothers who bring their children to KKK meetings to indoctrinate their children to racism. Racism is something that people are taught. So how can each one of us? Yes, we can go to a protest, and as long as we're peaceful and do it legally, I think that's one way to do it. But we also have to be very aware of how we're raising our children. What are the comments that we make about other groups of people? How do we talk about other groups of people in front of our children? And there'll be opportunities for each one of us, to teach our children tolerance, to teach them acceptance of each other. And that's very important for those of us that have children. Some of you do already. Most of you will someday in your life. So be aware, be very cognizant that the example that you are leading and the comments that you make, the way you treat people of color will make a huge impression on your children. And to teach them to be accepting and tolerant of each other, because we have so much to learn. And the world is changing. If we look around our own communities, there's more and more people from everywhere. So to try to be tolerant and accepting will make it so much easier for us all to get along as in the future. So just be aware that that's something each of us can do to combat racism. And now Chapter 4 covers gender inequality. And that is another big topic, and it does cause many, many social problems. Primarily for women, but it's also caused problems for men. But the first thing that the book talks about in Chapter 4 is gender identity. And how do we get our gender identity? And they define it as the personal traits and the life chances that society gives to us, whether we're male or female. And how does that happen? Well, we're born male or female. And then we begin to learn what is acceptable for boys and girls. And that really starts at birth. From the time we're born, we name babies certain names, girl names, boy names. We dress them in certain colors, pink and blue. So from the day we're born, we begin to learn what it is to be a girl or a boy, a man or a woman. And those are called gender roles, the set of social expectations that are based on the biological characteristics and differences. Now, we do know that there are differences between men and women, but we're going to talk about whether some of those are better than others. Now, if you look on page 104 of your textbook, there is a map, a global map. And if you look at that, it shows you which countries actually give women more social standing. And the United States is not in the top group. Sometimes I would like to think we are, but we're not. who actually gives women the best social standing are the European countries, Australia, Canada. We're right underneath those, but we're not at the top. So most countries have a long ways to go. We're better than a lot, but we're not at the best. So these ideas that we have about men and women and which group is better, if you want to say that, is pretty much a worldwide attitude. So this leads us to something called sexism, the belief that one sex is innately superior over another. And in most cultures, they do believe that it's the male role that's superior. And in most cultures around the world, the male role is respected more and given more power than the female role. Now, when we talk about that, when we look at what are the roles that we are taught in our country, what is the role of a woman? Well, we're taught that the woman is to be gentle and kind and sensitive and emotional and usually a follower. Whereas the male role, we are taught that they are to be tough and strong and unemotional and leaders. Now, are all women born with personalities that are kind and gentle and emotional and sensitive and to be followers? And are all men born to be tough and strong and unemotional and leaders? No, I don't think so. I think we're all born with our innate personality, and I think some people are born with a stronger personality than others. But in general, in most cultures, including ours and this country, the male role, to be tough and strong and a leader, is the one that is more respected and given more power than the female role. And there's the problem. It's the fact that one role and one set of qualities is considered more important and better than the other. Personally, I think that there are times to be kind and gentle and emotional and maybe even be a follower to go along with others. But for all of us, there's times to be tough and strong and be a leader. So I think that all the qualities of men and women are valuable. But unfortunately, in most cultures, we're taught that the male role is more important and better. And that is called sexism. Well, how has that affected the world? How does that cause problems? Well, we know that for women, there have been some strides because women began to feel in the 1920s, and this month, August of 2020, it will be 100 years that women got the right to vote in this country. So for about 150 years, women in this country, when it was first founded, did not have the right to vote. And actually, my grandmother was 12 years old when her mother got the right to vote, and she could remember that. So, when I was born in 1951, women had only had the right to vote for 31 years. So that was a long road. But women began, with the right to vote, they began to stand up for themselves and begin to want to be more equal. So with that, one of the ways that women, I think, really began to realize that one way for them to gain more power in their life was to get more education. And so today, more women actually get AA degrees and BA degrees than men. Today, 62% of all AA degrees go to women. And if you go to any of the COS graduations, you'll see that the names of women are much longer than the names of men. There are more women graduating from COS every year than men. And 57% of all four-year degrees are granted to women. And actually, they're just a tiny bit of percentage higher of PhDs now going to women. But women do still tend to go into female-dominated areas like education and social work, those type of areas. But they are getting lots of education, and that does give them more opportunities, and that does tend to give them a little bit more power over their own lives. But unfortunately, we still see a discrepancy in income. We still see that men do earn more money than women. But one of the things that really helped in terms of education, and I think it helped women in general, is that in 1972, Title IX was amended to the Civil Rights Act. And what Title IX said was that any school, K through 12 or college, that receives government money must appropriate equal amounts to programs for men and women. So prior to 1972, there were really very few sports programs in the school systems or colleges for women. When I graduated in 1969, there were really none. There was not a girls' basketball team. There was not a girls' soccer team. There was not a girls' softball. Uh, there really wasn't much of anything. Maybe in a few schools, but that was very, very rare. Today, more than 8 million girls participate in some kind of sports through high school and college. So Title IX made a huge difference in the kind of programs that were now available for women. And many of you may have played some kind of sports in high school or college. And you can really thank Title IX for that change, because prior to that, there was very little accessible to women in terms, especially in sports programs. But I think sports programs do help men and women to feel more confident. They build self-esteem. There's so many things that people learn, how to get along with others, team spirit, how to cooperate. So much comes from working on team sports. So for women to be able to experience that on a higher level has really helped them in many, many ways. So Title IX was extremely important in terms of advancing women in so many areas. But again, unfortunately, there still is a discrepancy in how much money women earn versus men in our country. So it says men typically earn more than women and they get promoted more than women. And in 2011, only 11% of engineers were women, and only 1.8% of CEOs in the big companies were women. Now that is improving. We're seeing more and more women that are reaching for those positions, but it is very difficult for women to achieve high levels in engineering, math, and science. I've had many students, many female students, tell me that they actually changed their majors because of the way they were treated when they got into the programs for medicine, for chemistry and biology. And so women still get, I think, an attitude when they get into these areas that is very difficult to overcome, because men are supposed to be the ones that do better in math and science, and that's really unfounded. There are many, many women that have an aptitude for math and science, but they're told from early on that men are the ones that are better and that women should be the teachers of the little children. And so a lot of women grow up believing that they are not going to be as smart in math and science. And that's almost like the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're told that enough, you begin to believe it. So unfortunately, a lot of people do believe that women are not suited for certain jobs, and that does hold them back. So there is still a distinct inequity in pay for women, and women don't get promoted as much as men. There's still an idea, and we'll talk about that in a minute, about the fact that a lot of people do believe that men are better leaders, better bosses, better supervisors than women. And this does lead to a lot of gender discrimination. And what about politics? How has that affected women having political power? Well, it has really affected. Like I said a minute ago, the 19th Amendment, which was August of 1920, was the time when women got the right to vote. And that was 100 years ago this month. So definitely women have been kept out of the political field, and first of all, just by voting. But obviously now we've had that right for 100 years. But how has that affected women in politics in general? And when you see that, and how did the right to vote come about for women? And it really started with slavery. Women began to realize in the mid 1800s, as we went into the Civil War, black people are not allowed to vote. And so they began to look at that and say, well, wait a second, we're being treated just like they are. We're being treated like we're not full citizens, in the same way that African Americans are being treated as not full citizens, and that's not right. So the whole idea of women getting the right to vote really came out of the abolition of slavery way back in the 1800s. And it grew and grew until, and the women had to fight. And you'll see right now, because it is a 100-year anniversary, there are quite a few documentaries that are available right now covering how women got the right to vote, articles in magazines. And it was a long, hard fight for women to finally, actually Tennessee was the last state to allow women to, and it gave them enough states to ratify the 19th Amendment. So it took a long, hard fight. I believe Montana was the first state, or it was either Montana or Wyoming were the first states to allow women to vote. But it was a long haul before they had enough states that agreed to let women to vote in order to ratify the 19th Amendment. So it was a long, long fight. Obviously, a good fight, because how can you gain power in any system if you can't even vote for the people that are making the decisions? Well, in 2011, only 24% of the legislators were women. And in 2011, only 6 of the state governors were women. Now, actually, in the last few years, that actually went down to 5, and I'm not sure how many state governors there are today. You could probably Google that. But historically, there have not been nearly as many female governors as there have been male governors. And again, it's that idea that men are the better leaders. And in 2011, 73 out of the 435 members of Congress were women. That was only 17%. And only 17% of senators were women. I do think that in the last election, we did see more women being elected. And I think in the one coming this fall, I definitely think you'll see more women being elected. There's been a big movement for women to get more involved, especially with the Me Too movement that has really encouraged women to start going forward in many areas. And so you're seeing many more women getting into the political arena and running for certain positions in our political system. And I also, on Chapter 4, one of the extra credits that I will allow you to do is I will give you 10 points if you vote in the November election. I can't tell you enough how very important, for many, many reasons, it will be for all of us to vote in 2020. And it may not be the easiest process because of the pandemic, but very crucial that we do that. So if you do that, and you can screenshot a copy of the little label that says you voted, then I will allow you to get 10 points of extra credit. But I think you'll see more women. And this week, Joe Biden is supposed to announce his running mate, because he will probably be the candidate, the Democratic candidate, and he has vowed for it to be a woman. So probably in the next few days, we will see history being made in that a woman will be on the ballot for, well, actually, Geraldine Ferraro years ago was the first woman to be considered a vice president. But if Biden's elected, it will definitely make history to have a female vice president, and it will change the attitudes in this country tremendously. So again, some of that is changing, but we obviously have a way to go because there are not nearly as many women involved in our political system as there are men. Well, one of the issues that does happen because of gender discrimination, and because more men tend to get promoted than women, and they tend to be the boss and the supervisor much more often, and they are then in a position of power. And that brings us to sexual harassment, which is quite common in the workforce. And just as a side note, the people that usually are sexually harassed are young women. And that means those of you in this class, the females, the women in my classes, I have to say to you that you should be very, very careful in any job not to go alone with a male employee into a room, into a stock room, a back room, any room. And you should never go into a situation with your supervisor, if it's a male, alone, ever. And if the supervisor gives you a hard time with that, you tell them, if they say, I want to see you, you say, okay, just a minute. And then you go get someone to go with you. So it's really, because that's usually where sexual harassment, serious cases start, is when a male in a position of power in a job is alone with a young female employee. And so I can just urge all the young women, in my classes and everywhere, that you should never go alone with a male employee or boss, because that is where it is likely to happen. But there are two types of sexual harassment. One is called quid pro quo, and that is the most obvious kind. And again, that's when a boss, and it can be a woman, but that is more rare, but it's usually a man that has political power, job power, um, will threaten an employee that if they do not have some kind of sexual contact with them, that they will lose their job or not get a promotion. And so that is the most blatant kind of sexual harassment, to hold that kind of power over a female employee. It's usually a female employee. It could be a woman sexually harassing a man, but that is very rare because most women are not in the position and don't have the power to do that. So it's someone having the power in their job, their control, power over someone else's ability to keep their job or get promoted at their job, and to ask of them or demand of them sexual favors of some kind in order to keep that job or get promoted. So if that happens to you, I really encourage anyone that has that to occur to document everything as much as you can, write things down, document incidents, get witnesses if possible, and then you need to take that to your supervisors and make them aware that this needs to stop. If they don't do anything about it, and they may even be part of the problem, then it's good to see an attorney. And if you don't have money for an attorney, you can usually go to the legal aid offices in your county. In Tulare County, we do have Tulare Office of Legal Aid, and any kind of legal advice and help is free. So it's really important to document, get witnesses if possible, and then take that to the attention of the superiors at your job. And I know sometimes that means your job will be threatened. And that's terrible because I know many people need their job desperately. But in order to stop this, people have to come forward. And with the Me Too movement now, women in particular, are coming forward and saying this won't be tolerated. So the other type of sexual harassment is called hostile work environment. And that's when any sexual comment, joke, pictures are present within the work environment. And one thing that's getting to be more and more common is things that come across your computer. If you happen to be someone who works at a job where you are on the computer and suddenly some kind of weird emails or something are coming across of a sexual nature, copy it. Copy it and take it to your supervisor and say, no, this is a hostile work environment. This is sexual harassment. I won't tolerate this. And that actually happened to me here on this campus. I got some very inappropriate sexual emails, and I copied them and put them in the box of the president of the college. And I said, this needs to stop because it's sexual harassment. And it did. So, it's okay to step up. You have to think about it, document it. Don't just don't rush into it, but think it through, get the proof that you need, and then go forward, because sexual harassment is a horrible, demeaning experience, and it has horrible repercussions mentally and financially on people. So hopefully with the Me Too movement, we're making progress with this, and we can all be part of that. Well, one of the terms that they have in this chapter is called androgynous. Now, we talked about the male and female roles, and that women, again, are taught to be kind and gentle and sensitive and emotional, and men are taught to be tough and strong. But the term androgynous means that it's someone who's able to bring all those social and personality traits together. A woman that can be tough and strong and a leader, but she can also be gentle and kind and emotional and sensitive. And it's a man that can be sensitive and kind, but also tough at times and be a leader. So those people, that term is called androgynous, someone that can bring the qualities of both of those roles together. And we're seeing this happen more, I think, in every generation. You're seeing these roles starting to blend. Part of this is forced on us. It was forced on us because of the economic situation in our country. As we saw inflation get worse and worse over the 70s, and it started to get worse in the 90s, 80s, and so it got to where most married couples began to realize that if both of them didn't work, they weren't going to be able to afford the basics for their family: a home, a car, in a decent neighborhood. And so it forced women back to work. Well, that brought about lots of changes for men and women. So it kind of forced men in some ways. Sometimes they had to cook dinner. Sometimes they had to do the laundry because mom was at a meeting or mom was at work or she wasn't going to be home till late. So it has kind of forced, and because women had to go back to work, it kind of forced them into the male world. It used to be that men were the main providers, but now women have had to go back to work in order for their families to survive. So it has kind of put them in more of a provider role. So the economic situation has kind of forced some of these roles to blend together a little bit, but they do say that people that are able to blend the roles are more adaptable because you never know what's going to happen to us in life. We may be in a situation where at times we need to be very tough and strong and lead, but we may be in situations where we need to show great kindness and sensitivity. So we never know what situation we'll be in. And so the ability to put these roles together and blend them a little bit is very advantageous to all of us. Now, who is this usually easier for? Usually easier for women. Because if a woman takes on some of the roles of a man, she's taking on the roles of the more respected gender. Whereas if a man takes on the roles of a woman, he's taking on the roles of the lesser respected gender. So in a way, a woman gains if she blends them, a man loses. Now, this is wrong. I think it's wrong. And hopefully, every generation is starting to change their feelings about which role is more important and which one is more respected. And I think we are going towards what they call role equity, which is it's the perspective that all of us can make our choices according to what we truly, truly want to do and believe is our best quality, but we're not there yet. I think many of us are still highly influenced by society and what society tells us we should be doing. And so we still have a lot to overcome. One of the issues they talk about towards the end of the chapter is homophobia. And homophobia is defined as the aversion or hostility towards people thought to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. And this is very prevalent in our culture because in our culture, even though we're getting there, we still respect the male role, the tough, strong, and that's what men are supposed to be. And so there is a great deal of homophobia. Again, that has been changing. One of the big things that happened 2 years ago was that our government changed the law on marriage, and now same-sex couples can get legally married. And you're seeing all kinds of changes. You're even seeing athletes, male athletes, basketball players, a few football players have come forward and said that, and this is supposed to be the macho sport is football and basketball, but we've had a few, not very many, but we've had a few males of sports coming out and saying that they are gay. And so we're getting more and more comfortable. We're seeing gay people on popular TV shows. And so there has been a lot of progress with our homophobic feelings. But there's still a lot of ground that we need to cover to go forward. One of the ways that it has changed, though, is the military. In 1994, they allowed women to be fighter pilots and be on combat ships. Prior to that, they could not be. As of 2 years ago, January, women could be in every area of the military. So in a lot of areas, you're seeing that change, and they did allow gay people to be open. Prior to President Clinton, you could not be gay and be in the military. Of course, I'm sure there were gay people there, but they just covered it up. Clinton started the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and which meant that as long as you don't say anything about it, you can be in the military, just don't make it obvious. Well, then Obama changed that. He went one step further and said, you can be openly gay and they cannot discriminate against you and keep you out of the military. So we've made some progress, but there are still people that have their views about people that are gay or transgender. But what's important is all the studies, the medical studies, and there have been quite a few now in the last 25 years. They've done studies of people who say that they are primarily homosexual, and have been their whole lives. And when they do brain studies and genetic studies of people who have said they were homosexual their whole lives, there are differences. There's differences, chromosome differences, neurological differences. And so what those studies are telling us is that homosexuality is not a choice. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not some people who choose to get themselves into a homosexual relationship on some level. There are people that do that maybe are primarily heterosexual. And today, most people are saying that we're sort of on a spectrum. Are people either or? Are they either heterosexual or homosexual? Well, there are people obviously that they say are bisexual, and a lot of things in between. Um, but but basically, the studies are showing that homosexuality is genetic. It's not a choice. You are born with a certain propensity, a certain attraction to one group of people or another. And most people that will tell you that they've been heterosexual all their life have pretty much, that's their orientation from birth. And people that are homosexual will tell you the same thing. Now, the one thing I think that's confusing is that sometimes you have homosexual people that will marry someone of the other gender. And this used to be pretty common. Now that marriage in same-sex couples is legal, I don't think you will see it as much. And because people are being a little bit more comfortable being open about their sexuality. But people used to marry someone of the other gender and have children because they were trying to cover it up. Well, then after about 15 or 20 years of that and being dishonest and having all kinds of turmoil about it, many people decided to just be honest and open. And so I think a lot of people would say, oh, someone turned gay. Well, usually in those circumstances, someone was trying to avoid the reaction that they would get if anybody knew they were gay. And there are still people that grow up that they know deep down that they are not heterosexual, but they're so afraid to come out and be open about it because their own family will reject them. If you look at the people that are harassed and sometimes even tortured the most, in a lot of cultures, it's homosexuals. In Russia, it's illegal, and they will be tortured, jailed. And this is a big issue right now, is the Russians' outlook on homosexuality. So there are places where homosexuality is illegal, and so many people in different cultures are afraid to be open about their sexuality because of the repercussions. So some people have tried to cover it up, but over time, usually it gets harder and harder to do that. But basically, again, what the studies tell us is that our sexuality is genetic, and it isn't really a choice. But people they still have choice, and sometimes they choose different situations for different reasons. But basically, you know, knowing that our sexuality is genetic tends to really make us realize that to judge someone on something that isn't their fault. I mean, you're born, as Lady Gaga says, I'm born this way. And so hopefully we're making a lot of progress in that area and getting to where we can accept people regardless of their sexuality. And we have to remember, sexuality is such a small part of who we are. It is a part of who we are, but it's not our true core. And so I think some of the prejudices that people have felt against homosexuals has been truly unfounded. And I have a lot of homosexual friends myself, and most of them are the most wonderful people, and they're very loyal, honest, hardworking people. And not that there aren't bad homosexuals, there's bad people in every group, but I think that we have to be careful when we judge others in any category. And so hopefully we're getting better at this one, and homophobia will be less and less over the generations. I hope so. And one of the, and again, to kind of explain the inequality in the job area for women in particular, is something they call the glass ceiling, and that's the last thing on your outline. And it's that the glass ceiling is what they call an invisible barrier that women find when they try to get a promotion in their top corporate positions. So because, again, men are taught to be the better leaders, we all think that men are probably better at being the leader. I mean, we've never had a female leader in our country. We've never had a female president. So I still think deep down, we all feel that, well, not all of us, but many of us still believe that what we've been taught, that men are the best leaders. So that does keep women from a lot of the top positions. This is not anything in writing. That's why they call it the glass ceiling. It's invisible. It's just an attitude, but it's real. And it does keep women from being promoted as often and to the higher positions more than men. So, or less than men. So the glass ceiling is real. We're breaking it in certain ways. We may see it broken in this next election. I hope so, because I think that men and women each have a lot to bring to their jobs, to their families, to their friends, to every aspect of their life. And we all have the good qualities, and I think they should all be highly, highly valued. Um, One of the big controversies also is uh, are men physically stronger? And does the male hormone give men more physical strength? And that gives us the big controversy: is will there ever be a woman in the NFL? I think there will. It may not be in my lifetime. I think it'll be in yours. But yes, testosterone does give men more muscle. There, and I've seen women that want more muscle and they have taken steroids. And they will get more muscle if you take steroids, which is essentially the male hormone. Um, and in general, because men have a higher testosterone level than the majority of women, they will have more muscle mass. But what they have found is that when women start to train athletically on the same level as men from the time they're small, they actually have caught up with them in many, many areas. Today, women in the Olympics are just a few minutes behind men in the marathon. So women are achieving more and more athletically, and that doesn't mean that we have to take steroids and be muscular, because yes, men do have more muscle mass because of testosterone. But with the right athletic training, women can gain just as much or almost as much physically as men. And of course, some women are larger built and there are some female tennis players that could beat most men tennis players. They may not be able to beat the best in the world, but they could beat most men. So we're seeing women achieve more and more athletically. But yes, testosterone does make the difference for men. Um, and we also know that there are some differences. Obviously, there's some difference biologically, but there's some differences in men and women neurologically. Actually, when it comes to language, that's a big difference in men and women, because the part of the brain that governs learning language and using language is usually larger and more active in the female brain than it is in the male brain. So, does that affect the way we communicate? Does it affect the way we talk and how much we like to talk about things? Yes, women tend to be more verbal. Not all women, but the majority. And so, just the fact that we do communicate differently, and that women usually are a little bit more verbal. They actually learn language usually more quickly than a boy, than a little boy. So we know that there are differences neurologically that can actually affect the way we learn things. Um, so yes, there are biological and even neurological differences between men and women. And when it also, what tends to happen because of our social roles, which is kind of interesting, because of our social roles, um, we have women that use language in particular to get more connected. If you listen to men when they talk, they frequently use it to show power and strength, whereas when women talk, they tend to show they want connection, they want more intimacy, they want more closeness. So, because of our differences in the way we learn and use communication, you see that it plays out in the way we communicate with each other. One of the ways that we also see that affecting us is that men tend to have more friends, but not as close friends. Women tend to have fewer friends, but the ones they do have are much closer and intimate. So we can see where some differences, physically and biologically, lead us into different areas, different strengths and weaknesses in life. But we also know that in many ways we're similar. We all have feelings. We all have two eyes, one nose, 10 fingers, 10 toes, one heart, two kidneys. In many, many ways, men and women are the same. But there are biological and neurological differences. But it's also society. It's what society tells us. So there are differences, but I think sometimes we stress those almost too much. We tend to call each other the opposite sex. Are we really opposite? Um, Maybe in some ways, but in a lot of ways we are more similar than we are different. But we are taught that we are so different. And then we're supposed to get married and get along, which is very difficult for a lot of heterosexual couples. But basically, gender discrimination does cause many, many social problems, and for men and women. Not only has it kept women from political and financial power in a lot of cultures around the world, but for men, they've missed out too. They've missed out on having close relationships with their children, and also carrying a huge financial burden if they're trying to be the sole provider. So some of the changes that we're seeing will benefit women, but I think they'll also benefit men. Hopefully they will. I think we all deserve to have a full life, to make our choices based on what we truly believe is right for us. And as we move forward with gender equality, I hope that every generation gets much better at this. So hopefully, if you've taken some notes and study the outline, you'll do very well on your next quiz.